Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's so wonderful to have the family back together, especially after that hiatus caused by the pandemic. Since many of you were last with us, we've had some staff changes, so I want to welcome you on behalf of our staff and introduce I'm going to introduce the entire staff, some of whom will be new to just about all of you. Of course, we miss our staff who have gone on to new adventures, especially our beloved Chanel, but we're delighted to be staffed now by such wonderful people. Of course, the chief is Brad Wilson, and Brad is here. All of you know Brad. Our new assistant director, is a former visiting fellow of the Madison program, Shiloh Brooks, and we're delighted to have Shiloh with us. I think just about everybody knows our wonderful program director, Debbie Parker. Debbie Parker's right over there. I want to introduce Jonathan Giuffra. Jonathan, where are you? Raise your hand over here. Annika Nordquist, our podcaster extraordinaire, right over here. Michael Schmidt, please welcome Michael. Christy Johnson. And of course, you all know our senior statesman, our senior scholar, the great Alan Guelzo. Now it is my very great pleasure and honor to confer the James Q. Wilson Award on our honoree. Entirely appropriately, Gordon Wood was born in Concord, Massachusetts. He was graduated summa cum laude from Tufts and then served our country in the United States Air Force. He went on to Harvard for his PhD, where he studied with the legendary Bernard Bailyn. For many distinguished scholars, it takes many words to sum up their achievements and accomplishments. Professor Wood's achievements and accomplishments, though many and grand, I think can be captured, summed up in a single word: magisterial. He is a magisterial scholar of the American Revolution and the American founding, and all of us who work in these vineyards are deeply, deeply in his debt. He's the recipient of many, many distinguished honors: the Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize, the National Humanities Medal. But we have the joy of giving him the best prize of all, the James Q. Wilson Award. So Gordon, please step forward, and I confer upon you the James Q. Wilson Award for Distinguished Scholarship on the Nature of a Free Society from the Association of Free Institutions. Gordon.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for receiving this award. I met James Wilson just once at a conference a couple of years before he died, and he was in pure form. I had heard about him. He was courteous, confident, and he was dealing with a very tricky issue in that conference, race and crime, and he handled it with great aplomb. And I just read almost everything he wrote, and I think he's one of the great political scientists in our history. And so I'm very grateful and honored to receive an award that's in his name. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. And now let me call Alan Guelzo forward for a conversation with Professor Wood.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first keynote conversation of our 2023 Giuffra Conference with the great Gordon Wood, the Alva O. Way University professor and professor of history emeritus at Brown University. The subject of our conversation today is American history, and Gordon Wood in particular. And there's a great deal to say about both. Long, long ago, when I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, no area in American history had more attention to it, paid to it than early American history, which is to say the Revolutionary era and before. And in those halcyon days, you were liable at Penn to be a partisan either of Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution or Gordon Wood's The Creation of the American Republic. Since this is the creation of the American Republic right here, you know which side of that divide I was on. It was a partisanship so noteworthy that it even made it into the screenplay of Good Will Hunting in 1997, with this famous encounter in a Harvard bar. I'm supposed to press it this way. Just hit the back one. Now I'm supposed to press which? Go back. How about if I go forward? How about if I let you do it?
Revolutionary utopia in the capital forming effects of military mobilization. As a matter of fact, I won't, because war drastically underestimates the impact of social distinctions predicated upon wealth, especially in area wealth. We got that from Vegas. It's kind of page 98, right? You like to write something big for us? We're going to allow some on this morning.
You know, he goes on to say the really great historian of America is Howard Zinn. Zinn was a neighbor and a friend of Damon's, so they knew each other very personally. Zinn's sales went way up. Mine didn't go at all.
Although the truth is that most of the rest of us are happy to get cited in footnotes. Gordon Wood got a movie. Even more, Creation of the American Republic won the Bancroft Prize in 1970. Gordon also won a Pulitzer for The Radicalism of the American Revolution in 1992, won another Pulitzer nomination for Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic in 2000. And along the way, he's written memorable essays on rhetoric and reality in the American Revolution, and conspiracy and the paranoid style, causality and deceit in the 18th century. And most recently, he's written Power and Liberty, Constitutionalism in the American Revolution, which was published in 2021, and which I had a very fine time reading an August afternoon on the plaza out in front of the National Constitution Center. Couldn't think of a better place to read it. So we have Gordon Wood as our guest today, and I want to lay a number of interesting questions before him. First of all, Gordon, you had what I can only call an auspicious beginning as an early American historian, because as Robbie said, you were born in Concord, Massachusetts. It doesn't get much more auspicious than that. Did you always see yourself as interested in American history?
Well, I was always interested in history. I wasn't necessarily committed to American history, but I actually wasn't planning on becoming a historian. I went into the Air Force because I had a ROTC commitment, and my treatment by the military, I was going to come back to Fletcher School, which is connected with Tufts. It's like a foreign service training school like Georgetown, and become an FSO. But my experience in the military was such that I said, oh, I don't think I want to be tied up with the federal government at all because it's so arbitrary. I was ROTC, but my eyes, when I graduated, weren't up to snuff. I couldn't be a navigator. They said, what school would you like to go? I said, intelligence school. I said, no, you're going to photo intelligence, which is an entirely different thing. You look at buildings to see whether that's a hospital or a munitions factory. And then, so they sent me to Texas to learn to be a photo intelligence officer. I was trained a whole year. And then they sent me to, they said, where would you like to go? I said, I'd like to go to Europe. I hadn't been to Europe. Oh, no, you're going to Japan. I said, well, that's great. I might not. But when I arrived in Japan, the squadron was run by a young first lieutenant, NYU ROTC guy who did not like to get up in the morning to sign the morning report, which is essentially attendance for the squadron. And so he talked the colonel into, we need another officer in the orderly room, sir. And the colonel said, yeah, you think so, Lou? Yes, we do. And so I came in simply to sign the morning report at 7:30, but this adjutant didn't want me to do anything, so I sat all day long at my desk and read history books. At that point, I just decided, I think maybe I should go to graduate school instead of going back to the Foreign Service. So that's how I ended up a historian.
What about Concord? What was it like to grow up in Concord, Massachusetts? Were you
Oh,
always in the environment of...
No, this is where it's a little deceiving. We lived in West Acton, which in those days was a real farm. My father was running a chicken farm, and it was just rural area. The nearest neighbor was probably half a mile away. Concord was the hospital where I was born. That's the beauty of it. We didn't live in Concord.
So you didn't cross paths with Emerson or Thoreau?
No, I actually.
No, okay. Teaching and writing American history has become something of a formidable task these days. American history has come into some hard times, and there are fewer celebrations of American history. There's fewer visitations to historical sites. There are fewer history teachers and students at almost every level. Is this an ominous sign in your mind?
Well, I think that's true. I was connected with Colonial Williamsburg, and certainly attendance is way down. There are so many different opportunities for recreation that it's difficult to maintain these living history museums. But I think the basic fact is that we're not really a very historically minded people. And I'll talk some more about that tomorrow in the panel discussion. But there is a lot of, the Academy is in deep trouble, as we all know, but I think there's a lot of popular history that's being written and read and bought. There are dozens of popular historians who are writing books that are selling. So I'm not sure that the history as such is in that great trouble, but certainly the Academy and history in the academic world is suffering.
The Czech dissident, Milan Kundera, said at one point, the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. Should we be listening to Kundera's warning?
There are these statues going down, and they probably some of them should, because they were created in for example, the generals of the Confederacy probably should be put into museums, because we're not celebrating those figures any longer. And of course, when we saw Lenin's statue pulled down in the 1990s, we applauded that. So we understand why statues are removed. I think they should be probably put into museums so that we don't lose a sense of what happened. But some of those were created in the 1920s, and they were part of an effort to reconcile the country, to bring the country together, part of the lost cause, which has, for many people, real pain is caused. So one understands that. But I do think there is a problem, as we're now in the middle of what you might call a great atonement for slavery and for its aftermath. And we'll just have to see ourselves through that. It's not clear how it's all going to play out, but we're right in the midst of something that's quite extraordinary, I think. And that explains a lot of what we're going through.
When you set out to write Creation of the American Republic, you said that you had merely wanted to write about how constitutions were made in the newly independent American states. What you discovered was that this constitution making rested on sources and beliefs that were unique to the American experience and the American background. And this is something which eventually set you apart from Bernard Bailyn, because Bailyn's ideological origins of the American Revolution wanted to stress the continuities of American politics with English political thought in the 18th century and even back into the 17th century. So the American Revolution for you really was a revolution. It was not just an extension of John Locke or the Commonwealth's men or the Puritans. It was based on, and these were your words, a powerful revolutionary ideology which was outside of the mainstream of English thought. Now, what pushed you in that direction? And what would you say then to John Brooks' criticism that you're perpetrating a George Bancroft-style version of American exceptionalism in suggesting this?
Well, you've got a lot packed into that question. Bailyn and I were reading the same pamphlets, these radical Whigs and Tory radicals as well, Bolingbroke. And those are the pamphlets that gave a very different picture of what was happening in England. I must have a great deal of sympathy for poor Robert Walpole, who had no intellectual supporters whatsoever. Every single artist, all the great poets, all the journalists and the writers, from Bolingbroke to Trenchard and Gordon, Cato's letters, were opposed to what Walpole was doing. And he could just sit back and say, well, shrug his shoulders and say, well, look, I'm just creating the greatest empire the world's ever seen. And with all the intellectuals opposed to him. They were setting forth a vision of what the society ought to be like that corresponded more closely with what already existed in America. For example, more religious liberty. They were advocating that, or they were advocating more participation in politics. Only 1 out of 6 adult males in England could vote, and that was very different in America. Colonial America, about 2 out of 3 adult males could vote. So Americans took this writing and said, this is more like us, and so they responded to that. I don't think that's where Bailyn and I differ. What Bailyn was not able to accept, and he used my book in his course, but he assigned only the middle chapters. He did not like the ending. He didn't like any suggestion that there was a social conflict, an emerging middle class, in particular in the North, that helped to transform the Constitution in the early decades of the 19th century. He saw the Constitution as a fulfillment of the Revolution, and he wrote a later chapter that was added to his ideological origins. I don't see the Constitution as quite that much of a fulfillment. It really is something not at all anticipated by anyone in 1776. No one in his wildest dreams conceived of a government as strong as the federal government. And it violated so much of what was conventional wisdom that it needs explanation. And I think it's harder to explain the Constitution than it is to explain the Revolution. The Constitution comes out of nowhere. No one predicted it. And so something awful had to happen in the late 1770s and the 80s to explain this extraordinary document and this really powerful government. We know how powerful it is because we have it now. So I think that there's where Bailyn and I parted, I think.
I mentioned John Brooke.
Brooke about
Well, I was going to say,
exceptionalism.
I mentioned John Brooke because he and I were grad students at Penn together.
Aha.
And John went one way around the world, and I went the other way around the world. So that's why I mentioned John and his suggestion that you're an exceptionalist.
Of course, we were an exceptional nation. We were a republic in a world of monarchies. And so that immediately made us exceptional. And I think that exceptionalism continued right up through Lincoln. When Lincoln says we're the last best hope, he's talking in the aftermath of the failures of the 1848 revolutions in Europe. Now, once the European nations caught up to us democratically, then I think our exceptionalism fell away. We're a big, powerful nation, but we're not fundamentally different from the European democracies. And that role, I think, that we played right through in some respects, right through the Cold War. Our response to the Russian Revolution is just extraordinary, the way we reacted to it. So we saw ourselves as somehow defending democracy against this other universalist ideology of communism. But I think that notion of exceptionalism has lost much of its earlier meaning. Certainly, we're not the only republic in a world of monarchies.
You said in creation of the American Republic that the most dramatic departure of the American Republic from previous understandings of government was that instead of incorporating social interests or social classes into the framework of government, like an aristocracy, the American Republic depended precisely on keeping those interests and classes from enjoying a foothold in the new American government. Did we succeed? Have we succeeded?
Well, of course, no, we haven't succeeded. But that was, I think, Madison's hope, to somehow create a structure that would allow for a more disinterested politics in a world in which was full of interests. I mean, Madison was that much of a realist. He said the society is riven with interests, competing interests, classes. How are we going to have a society in which the men in the legislature will not be advocating their own cause? That was such a violation of the common law. It was such a violation of to be a supporter of to be voting on issues that benefited you seemed to him to be the most dangerous element of democracy. But we haven't escaped that. I mean, in my own legislature, the firemen's union leader is in the legislature voting on pensions for the firemen. I mean, it can't get any more interested than that. The notion that the yearning for disinterested politics was very much a part of the founder's dream, and that was Washington, of course, all the way. We haven't received that. We've tried various times in our history. I mean, the irony is people are concerned about the administrative state and all those commissions emerging in the progressive era. Progressives faced this problem too. They were trying to look for disinterested politics, and they thought maybe if we create this kind of a commission with experts, then we'll have a disinterested people making decisions for us. Well, we know what's happened with those administrative bodies. So it's a dream that we've had all along, and I think it continues to be. We're hoping for somebody somewhere who doesn't have an interest to promote who would be our leader.
You think we'll ever get that?
Probably not. No, of course not.
You say in creation of well, let me put it this way. From 1969 until 1991, you published no new major book. But then in 1991, you broke the ice with the radicalism of the American Republic. And in radicalism, you pointed out something which seemed to be very obvious, and that is America was not Britain. Britain was a society that was marked by hierarchy, and the chief characteristics of its ruling class were patronage and leisure. Now suddenly the American Revolution changes that. We become a democratic people who want to rinse our hands of patronage and leisure in our rulers. How did we do that?
I'd have to sum up my book in 2 sentences. I mean, it's an extraordinary, as I got into it, thinking about it, look, we start with a colonial rebellion, and that was uniformly supported by the people. There were only about 20% of the population who were loyalists. It was an extraordinary step. But beneath the surface was a latent middle class that took advantage of the rhetoric and the revolutionary impetus to promote their own interests. And this is what creates in the state legislatures of the 1780s, the democratic excesses that so alarmed Madison. And by the early, Madison changes his mind in the 90s because he comes up against a bigger threat, that is Alexander Hamilton and his effort to make the United States a copy of Great Britain. And Madison goes into opposition and forgets about what he said earlier. And what you have then is a middle-class society emerging in the North, in particular, led by how to put it, a radical chic Republican slaveholding leaders in the South. It's an extraordinary irony of American history that the Democratic Party was dominated at the leadership level by Jefferson and Madison and other slaveholding aristocrats. But you have a very different world emerging in the North. And one of the points that I think is interesting, look at the Constitutional Convention of New York, where they're meeting, led by Martin Van Buren, who's the prototype of the new emerging politician who becomes, as you know, becomes president, having done nothing. He never led an army. He never wrote a great paper. He simply got together the best organized party that the country had ever seen in New York. And he says to his colleagues in New York, in this state constitutional convention, forget about those founders. They were aristocrats. We're Democrats, we have a whole new world to explore. And the notion of working becomes central to this middle class because the tradition was that only a gentleman did not work with his hands or even work at all. His money came without exertion. If you remember what Adam Smith said, the ideal political leader, and he meant the landed gentry of England, is someone whose income comes without exertion. They were drawing rents from their tenants, and that enabled them to be disinterested leaders. And that was Smith's point, and there was nobody in America who quite fit that, except the slaveholding aristocrats of the South. To some extent, they modeled themselves on the landed gentry of England. But in the North, the middle-class people have to justify their labor, and they turn it around. They turn it into a badge of honor that you're working, and so much so that it dominated the culture. So we never had a labor party the way they did in England because there was no need for it because people were saying everybody works. I mean, one of the great moments is Edward Everett, the man who became governor of Massachusetts and gave the long speech at Gettysburg that Lincoln had to listen to. Everett is running for office, and he has to justify. He says, "Look, I'm a lawyer. I work too." He's talking to the people of Massachusetts, working people, and he has to justify himself by saying, I'm working just as hard as you in my law office. Suddenly, the distinction that had been going back to Aristotle between the leisured class which ran the political world and the laborers was dissolved in America. Nowhere else in the Western world did that happen to the same extent. So that was part of my argument in radicalism. It is really a middle class revolution that was not at all anticipated by Jefferson or Madison.
One of the things that struck me most forcibly when I read Radicalism of the American Revolution many years ago when it came out was exactly how the emergence, the surprising, unprecedented emergence of that middle class, of the people who had been the leather apron people, the people who not only worked with their hands, but we're not ashamed of it. In fact, we're rather proud of it. The emergence of that middle class in the American environment was exactly what set things apart from slavery. And slavery, I remember you describing slavery, that up until toward the end of the last decades of the 18th century, slavery was simply a point on the spectrum of labor. And you really couldn't distinguish hugely between the work of the slave or the work of the apprentice, the work of the indentured servant. This is all compelled labor. And no one thought there was anything terribly wrong with anything along that spectrum. Now suddenly it is this middle class. How does this middle class, the emergence of this middle class and middle class politics, how does that impact an institution like slavery, which for centuries people have simply taken for granted?
That's right. Slavery was taken for granted for thousands of years without any substantial criticism. Now, we historians go back and we can find there was a Puritan in 1700 who criticized slavery, and there were some Quakers, but the first substantial criticism of slavery comes out of the American Revolution, and the first abolition movement, the first states in the world, in the history of the world, which had legally established slavery. The first states to abolish it were the northern states, starting in 1776, right away. They knew that it was incompatible with the revolution. So in the whole total history of the world, it's the American Revolution that launches the anti-slavery movement, that spilled out, and we were the first, not the British. We were the first to take on the international slave trade. And we are the first nations, the first states, all those eight northern states were the first states in the history of the world to abolish slavery. It's just an incredible moment in the history of the world. And you know, to refer to the New York Times, Hannah Jones business, they've got it all backwards. They think that we revolted to save slavery, and there's no evidence whatsoever for that. She's gotten hitched up with Woody Holton and concocted this notion that Dunmore's proclamation he's Governor Dunmore of Virginia, is sitting out in Chesapeake Bay on His Majesty's ship because he's fled from Williamsburg because the Patriots have taken over. By November of 1775 in Virginia, the revolution's over. But in desperation, military desperation, Dunmore issues a proclamation offering freedom to any slave who's willing to come to the cause of the crown. And about 300 slaves do that. But that's not the cause of the revolution. It has anything to do with it. It's a military exigency on the part of Dunmore, but somehow Woody Holton has convinced Hannah Jones that really is the key to the revolution. Well, the revolution in terms of Virginia is already over. That is to say, the Patriots are in complete control of Virginia's authority, and that's why Dunmore is sitting in a ship out in Chesapeake Bay. So it's beyond my ken to figure out what they're doing with that. Now there are many other things involved in that project, not 1619, as you know, and we can only see it as part of this great atonement we're going through, and we'll just have to, every issue of the Sunday Times has big page ads on the 1619 project, and people everywhere who read the New York Times are aware of it. And it's going to be hard to overcome from we academics trying to overcome that kind of publicity. The Times is a very powerful institution, and of course it's infected the schools as well. And it's going to be difficult, but we have to just be patient and see it through. No matter how many talks I would give opposing that, it would have very little effect for the time being. But that, get it straight, the American Revolution is the first place where a world where anti-slavery is made brought front and center to people.
Governor Dunmore's career subsequent to the American Revolution was not exactly a shining example of anti-slavery zealotry.
Yeah, well, he's a slaveholder.
Yeah, he goes off to the West Indies, and
He's not interested in, he's interested in destroying the revolution, of course. And he thought maybe this would be a way of doing that. But he is not an abolitionist.
And I think, too, it's also a case that Dunmore is using a strategy that was actually a fairly conventional strategy in colonial warfare going all the way back to the very end of the 16th century, in which English colonists try to rouse the slaves of Spaniards against their masters. The Spaniards try to rouse the slaves of English colonists against their masters. It's not an abolition movement. It's a light a fire in the rear movement. And this, again, is something which tends to get glossed over. But not by you, not by a number of other historians, and certainly not in Radicalism of the American Revolution. The revolutionary leadership that you describe in Radicalism, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, none of these people seem to have planned for Americans to become a democratic people. Why? Why did this take them by surprise?
Well, they certainly hadn't anticipated what was happening in the 1780s. Madison could never have done what he did in getting together that convention if it hadn't been for the support he had among elites all over. The emerging democratic excesses in the state legislatures, particularly the printing of paper money, was just something they just simply hadn't expected. And that's, as I've argued in many places, that's the main force. By 1786, almost everyone in the political nation was ready to grant 2 amendments to the Articles of Confederation. That is, a taxing power, a very limited taxing power, tariffs on imports of 5%, and giving the Congress the right to pass navigation acts, that is, to control international trade. Everyone agreed with that. Now, there was a little bit of problem. First, Rhode Island wouldn't agree because you needed unanimity, and then New York didn't. But sooner or later, it was clear that that would be accepted. Madison and his fellow reformers used that as a means by which they can justify the meeting of this convention in Philadelphia. And he has no interest in just adding a couple of amendments. He's using that willingness of people to accept a meeting. Many anti-federalists said, oh, that's fine. They're going to meet there and they'll put a couple of amendments on the articles. But Madison has a much bigger plan. As you know, the Virginia plan has much more radical implications and shocked many people, and of course shocked all the people who later become anti-federalists, that that's not what we expected. But Madison and his colleagues want something different from the Articles because that allowed the state legislatures too much autonomy, and they were passing all these excessive democratic measures, particularly paper money. That is essentially my argument in a nutshell.
The American Revolution was not the only revolution at the end of the 18th century. There were revolutionary movements in Ireland, in Spanish America, even serious political unrest in England itself. Was the American Revolution part of a larger movement that was happening at the end of the 18th century? Or did the American Revolution, was it just following the beat of its own drum? Is there something international going on here, or is it simply a coincidence?
No, there's something international. And of course, the impact of the revolution was celebrated in many parts of Europe and Latin America. Of course, many were frightened by the anti-slave passing. I mean, they were still committed to slavery. So it has different reactions. But many liberals in Europe are excited. I mean, Richard Price, the Unitarian minister and a radical in England, says the American Revolution, and this is 1785, he says this American Revolution is the second greatest event in the history of the world. The second, only the birth of Christ being the greatest event. I mean, there were French liberals who were so excited about the American Revolution, of course, without realizing what they were doing, celebrating republicanism, liberty, and so on. Franklin's over there as our minister, and they collaborate with him and to publish all the revolutionary constitutions. Rochefoucauld is so excited about the American Revolution. He helps Franklin in this editing and publishing of the revolutionary state constitutions of 1776. And of course, Rochefoucauld is later stoned to death by a frenzied Paris mob in their own revolution, the French Revolution. There's a kind of radical chic that runs through the 80s in France. Mozart's the Marriage of Figaro, which mocks the aristocracy. And who goes to see it? The aristocrats. David's great painting, The Oath of Horatii, which is a Republican painting, 1785, 1786, and the aristocrats go and celebrate it. So what are they thinking? They don't realize what they're dealing with. It's a kind of radical chic that just gets out of hand and helps sustain their own revolution. A few years ago, a historian of revolutionary France, Rafe Blaufab, I don't know him, but he wrote me and sent me a copy of his book, which has been well received by other historians. It's called The Great Demarcation. He talks about, he said to me in a letter, he says, I read your radicalism book, and I think there's something similar what's happening in America to what's happening in France. And it has to do with the private ownership of public power. The Ancien Regime repudiated the private ownership of public power and created a whole new meaning of property. Well, I got thinking about this, and so I've written a little essay on property, which is coming out in the New England Quarterly. But it suggests, the private ownership of public power meant sort of the people had the sense that they owned their offices. And that was true in the colonial period. They would pass them on to their children. They weren't drawing any salaries, and that is important. But they felt they owned these offices. And that helps explain, for example, why John Adams keeps on Washington's cabinet. Because he was reluctant to release them because he had a feeling that somehow they owned the office. That's the traditional view. And Jefferson, who wants to get rid of all these Federalists, has the same problem. Can I do that? Can I fire everybody? And once you start paying salaries, you've got a whole new ball game. And that becomes a big issue. In England, MPs, members of Parliament, are not paid salaries until 1910. Now, what are the implications of that? Think about that. What does it mean to serve in office without pay? If you remember, Franklin, in one of his crazy moments in the convention, proposes that all members of the executive branch should serve without salary. From the president on down. Well, Madison says in his notes, well, we tabled the measure more out of respect for the old man than we did for than the practicality of the scheme. And there were members of the Southern delegation from South Carolina who don't want. They said at least the senators should not be paid their salary. So you have to think of the implications of that. And there are big debates. And the climax, of course, in America comes in the Jackson era, where Jackson, I don't think he said this, he said it, but he didn't write this, that all offices are not a species of private property, and that they should be open to everyone, anyone, regardless of education, wealth, status of any sort, no criteria whatsoever for office holding. And that's kind of a climax of this democratic notion. It suggests to me that we and the French are both emerging into modernity. Our revolution is, compared to the French, is in a kind of minor key. We don't have the violence they had, but we are having the same kind of transformation as a new social element emerges, a middle-class bourgeois element, if you will. And so there are similarities. between the revolutions. And Blaufeld called my attention to that. And his book is well worth looking at. And as they say, I'm not an expert in the French Revolution, but it's been well received by other scholars.
When you published Empire of Liberty in 2009, you drew on that theme about middle-class democratization. And you extended that up into the years of the early Republic, in which the real heroes of American life were, as you put it, inventors and merchants of all people in the world. But you also said that the American future was preeminently going to be Jefferson's rather than Hamilton's. Now, given how devoted Hamilton was to glorifying commerce, that's where you'd expect to find inventors and merchants. Why do you think we became more Jeffersonian than Hamiltonian?
Well, there's been, I think, a misconception of Hamilton. Richard Brookhiser's, he had at the New York Historical Society, he had a display of Hamilton as a great capitalist. I think that's wrong. Hamilton, of course, was interested in making the United States strong, but Hamilton's an 18th century figure. He's a Napoleonic figure. He wants glory for himself and for his nation. And of course, building up the military, building up the economy, that's all a means towards that end. He wants to make America the equal of England or any great state of Europe, with glory as his aim. So it's an 18th century, it's a traditional view. And to see him as the creator of capitalism is just one of the anachronisms that we often engage in. Jefferson, however, stood for the people. I mean, the people were sacred, and he never lost faith in them. Even in his deepest moments, he was very depressed by what was happening in the early republic. As any of the founders who lived into the early 19th century, almost all of them, except Madison, were depressed by what they saw because there's too much money making, too much drinking, too much paper money everywhere. It was not what they had expected. So that I think explains why Hamilton, of course, is used even by the late 19th century by businessmen so it wasn't Brookhiser's creation. They create a Hall of Fame in the 1890s in New York, and the first person elected to that Hall of Fame is Alexander Hamilton, and he's seen as the spokesman for business. That's just a distortion, I think, of what Hamilton stood for, but that's the way it is. I think we have to, Madison is hoping to create a structure in the Constitution that would keep these middle-class types out of the government. And he was hoping to do that by expanding the arena of politics and narrowing the representation. The first Congress is made up of 65 members for a population of 4 million. I mean, that was extraordinary narrowing, because that's smaller than most of the state legislatures. And his idea sort of worked this way. Take North Carolina, 232 members in their state legislature. They're given 5 congressmen in this new government. Now, there probably were only 5 college graduates in North Carolina in 1787, 1789. And Madison's hoping that those are the types that will get in. Men who are cosmopolitan, who see the broader things. The code words he uses for the middle class people that he dislikes are narrow-minded, parochial. Those are the terms he uses to describe the people he wants to keep out of politics. People like William Finley of Pennsylvania, not uneducated, an ex-weaver who is a big promoter of paper money. Well, his system doesn't work. Finley gets into the Congress, the second Congress, and serves into the early 19th century as the longest-serving congressman in the country. He's considered the father of the Congress. He retires in, I don't know, 1817, something like that. So Madison's scheme doesn't work because the middle class gets into the, but Madison is a politician. He's got other issues that he deals with. So he doesn't worry about what he said in the 1780s. He's got new problems in the 90s. And so you don't want to think of him as a political theorist like Locke or others who are writing for the ages. Madison's trying to deal with, he is a very thoughtful politician, but he's not a political theorist in the classic sense.
You said too much power, too much drinking, too much. It sounds like some modern universities. Your most recent book, Power and Liberty, is remarkable for packing an entire train of American thinking from the Declaration, in fact, before the Declaration, all the way up to the Constitutional Convention. You get it into a single line of thought between two covers. And the most surprising thing about the book is, and this is something that you mentioned, the most surprising thing about the book is the surprise that many Americans felt at the Constitution. Why did the Constitution surprise Americans?
Well, as I suggested, there's no one, and I don't know of anyone, in 1776 who even dreamed. It was inconceivable that they would create that kind of government. It just never entered their heads. I mean, the Articles of Confederation are best understood as a kind of our version of the EU. These are independent states coming together in a treaty, just as like the EU, without losing their individual sovereignty. And that's how we thought of it. When Jefferson talks about my country, he meant Virginia. And John Adams meant my country is Massachusetts. And so you have to think of that's what lies behind the Articles of Confederation. And now there's negotiation of how much power they would give to the Congress, but Article 2, I think, of the Confederation shows that they're not giving up their basic sovereignty. So that's the thinking in 1776, 1777. Now, how could they create this Constitution 10 years later with all of its enormous powers? And it just boggles the mind. Well, you have to explain that, and that's what I've tried to do. You can't think of it as inevitable. I mean, we tend to think that way because, it had to be, because, well, it's natural. We're living with it, and therefore it had to be, and you shouldn't think that way. You should stand in 1776 and say, where did this thing come from? Why would Madison write his Vices of the Political System of the United States? He wouldn't have written that in 1776. No one thought in those terms. It's the experience with the state legislature and how frightened they were of all this paper money. And of course, the only state he mentions in the Vices system is my own state of Rhode Island, which was notorious in its paper money issues, both as a colony and then later as a state. You know, Rhode Island, as I mentioned in the last little epilogue of that book, became an economic powerhouse in the 19th century. The by 1890, the 5 leading manufacturing firms in the world were located in the little state of Rhode Island. Gorham Silver, textiles, jewelry, small tools, the largest manufacturing firms in the world. And what's his name? The senator, Aldrich, Nelson Aldrich. No good biography of him because the Aldrich family won't allow the papers to be quoted. But he was, as I think Lincoln Steffens called him, the manager of the United States. He's the most powerful senator in the United States until LBJ. This little state of Rhode Island was the one who issued more paper money than any other state in the world. Paper money is capital. We have nobody's written books on this. By the eve of the Civil War, there are 10,000 different paper currencies flying around. It must have been so difficult to be a businessman. Think about it, if you're a shopkeeper and somebody comes in with you're in Providence and somebody comes in with a bill for $100 drawn on the First Bank of Nashville. what are you going to do? You don't want to turn them away. This is a piece of paper that you might give them a discount and then hope you can pass it on to somebody else.
I've often said to my students, what do you think the most popular periodical in America was before the Civil War? Sometimes they'll say, oh, maybe it was Harper's, maybe it was the Atlantic, maybe it was the North American Review. And I say, no, it was the Currency Circular. Because the Currency Circular would list the current values of all these different banks that were issuing paper money.
That's right. There's no, Madison wrote into the Constitution, he had this notion of a veto, the congressional veto. The idea that the states' laws would not be laws until they came to the Congress and the Congress approved them. Well, you can imagine how unworkable that would be. Every state had to send its bills to the. He sort of his model was the empire, and the king had final say over colonial legislation. Well, that was so impractical that wiser heads finally prevailed and said, look, we're going to take your veto out, and we're going to write up Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which is a prohibition on what the states can do. And one of those things, they can't pass tariffs, and it can't issue paper money. Now, if that had been rigidly enforced, it would have stymied the economy of the early republic. It wouldn't have gone. We had no currency. It would have been a terrible situation. So what the states do is get around that by chartering banks, which in turn issue the paper money. So you have, as I say, 10,000 currencies flying around by the eve of the Civil War. Now, the big change in the Civil War is that they have greenbacks, and finally, in the post-Civil War, the Congress simply taxes all those state banks out of business. There aren't any good books on this whole story. Economic history just doesn't interest most historians, or they feel overwhelmed by it. But this is a great story, and how business was created and how it flourished in that antebellum period is just simply not been well told.
Gordon, let me crank the clock back a bit. 50 years ago, we celebrated the bicentennial of American independence, and we did it with a gusto that was like a battleship full of firecrackers blowing up. We're now 3 years out from celebrating the 250th anniversary of independence, and the word celebration kind of fails on the lips. Why do we see so little interest in a celebration, an anniversary like this, now as opposed to then?
Well, we in the Academy know what the reasons are. The United States has lost, at least many people have lost confidence in the country. Patriotism is way down. There's a different climate. How long that will last, I don't know. But we're certainly in a very strange moment in the history of the United States. Even during the heyday of the Progressive era, Beard, for example, never lost confidence in the founders. He thought they were a bunch of robber barons or supporting robber barons, but nonetheless, he respected them. But there isn't that feeling now. The Progressive era had problems similar to our own with immigrants. The Sacco Vanzetti trial was as dramatic as, almost as dramatic as George Floyd in arousing people's passions. Talk to Italians whose parents or grandparents experienced that, and you realize it was a dramatic moment in our history. But there was confidence, and that's when we began assimilating these immigrants very positively. That's when you get the Mayflower story taught in the schools and so on. Well, the opposite is happening now, and so it is a difficult moment. How it's going to play out, I don't know. I think there's still a lot of latent patriotism among ordinary people. It's the intellectuals who seem to have lost confidence in the country, and the elites. But I think many ordinary people are still quite confident. But there is mistrust of all parts of the government, except maybe the military. But even now, the Supreme Court is brought into question. So it's not a good moment for celebrating the 250th, and so I'm not sure how that's going to play out. There is a national commission, but a couple of states, in Massachusetts, they've done very well with their commission, and Virginia has one too. But I'm not sure how my own state doesn't seem to even have any commission appointed. I don't know how that's going to all play out, but it's a very different world from any time in our history.
One thing you've never written is a full-scale major biography. I think the closest you've come to it is John Adams.
Well, Franklin.
Well, Franklin, that's true. If you had to write a big, let's say, 800-page biography of one of the founders, who do you think you'd like to take on?
Well, I guess you were talking about your favorite founder, if that's the right word to use, would be Washington. I mean, nobody came close to him in stature in any way. They respected him as something extraordinary. He was held in awe, even in his own time, because he was scrupulous in trying to be disinterested. I mean, I think of that time in 1784, the Virginia legislature awards him 150 shares in a canal for his contribution to American life. And he's very upset about this. He writes to a dozen people, to Fairfax in England, to Lafayette in France, to Jefferson, everyone else. What should I do? Should I accept these? Won't it taint my reputation for disinterestedness? He's quite aware of his own reputation. And he uses that term, because he uses disinterestedness as a synonym for classical virtue. And he's worried about it. And he's not even in office. He's out of office. But that's the kind of man he was. He just didn't want to do the wrong thing at all. And he wanted to show that he was pure. And Jefferson comes up with a solution. He said, look, why don't you just give them away, accept them, therefore you won't insult the legislature, but then give them away to some college, which he does. He gives it to Washington, which became Washington University, which is now Washington and Lee. That's a little problem for Washington and Lee these days, you can imagine. I talked to somebody who teaches there, and they're having a really difficult time with Robert E. Lee as part of their college name. But Washington, so far, has remained, even though he was a slaveholder, has I think, remained still somewhat sacred, I hope. But one can never tell in this day and age.
I would like to take this moment to throw things open to questions from the audience. It's usually our policy and practice in the Madison program to allow students to ask the first question. Now, I don't know if there's any Princeton undergrads who are with us today. Probably not. But if there are not, then I think we can open things to whatever questioner would like to be recognized. So I'm seeing a hand back up here. And if in asking your question, please remember several things. One is speak into the microphone. Secondly, tell us who you are. And third, remember to end with a question mark.
Okay. I'm Earl Maltz from Rutgers Law School. So I was struck by when you said that that everybody agreed that the federal government should have power to create navigation acts, whereas in my reading of the Constitutional Convention, it looked like that was an issue that divided the North from the South. So I was wondering if you could address that apparent tension.
Well, what I said was in the 1780s, that was one amendment that people were anxious to get because Massachusetts was passing its own Navigation Act, so wasn't New York, and it was creating chaos. People in Connecticut were having to pay taxes on goods that they shipped into Massachusetts, and they just knew that was, so they knew that we had to smooth that out, that you couldn't have all of these states competing with one another. Now, when you get to the convention, there are other issues. How much, especially with the South didn't want too much power over controlling exports or export taxes. And so there were other issues, but the notion that in the 80s there had to be some central authority to prevent the states from competing with each other in navigation, that was, I think, clear. And so you don't want to mix that up with what happened later in the convention, because then they're arguing about what will be the nature of this this power that would be given to the Congress, and that, I think, is a different question.
And I see a question back here.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Wood. On the point you made about the patriotism gap between kind of intellectuals and elites and more ordinary Americans, do you see a connection between that and sort of what you said earlier about the sort of trouble that academic history is in versus kind of more popular historical books are selling? Or I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on that matter, the sort of relative health of popular history versus academic.
Well, I suppose there's a connection. I mean, there's no doubt that the problems that we experience in our universities are to some extent shared in the wider world. That's why DeSantis took on Disney, for example, because Disney made some kind of concession to wokeism, I guess. But by and large, I think the extent to which we, meaning academics, are experiencing this problem is not as widely shared in the general public. They have this vague notion of the 1619 Project, but most of them do not read the New York Times and are not affected in the way elites are. I mean, the New York Times has a fantastic circulation now, especially on the internet, and they're doing okay. But we're talking about at most 1 million people, maybe 2 with the internet. But we're a society of 350 million or something like that. So it's a very tiny proportion of the society, but it's very influential. So there are lots of people who don't know what we're talking about. And so they had a grandfather who was killed in World War II. And so they have I think a natural patriotism that they just don't pay attention to what we're talking about. When it's called to their attention, then they react. And so we have a very curious situation where the non-college educated people are now becoming supporters of the Republican Party. Similar thing happened in England. It's curious, and the Democratic Party's become an elite party with the exception of black supporters, and they're counting on educated women. We'll see how those coalitions come together in the election. But it's a very different world from what you had in the 1950s and 60s, where the Republican Party always stood for big business, but had a lot of other support. Of course, too, it could never have been competitive. But for the most part, the Republican Party, right up through 1992 or so, 1994, when Gingrich won the House, his party won the House. The country was dominated by the Democratic Party in the way the Republicans dominated from 1870 to to Wilson's administration, which of course occurred only because the Republican Party split. So we're living in a different kind of political world today, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out. No one knows the future.
Yes, over here. We have 2 questions. We'll see which one grabs the microphone first.
Larry Mead from New York University. A word you haven't used in any of your responses to the questions is race or racism. And that I take to be the main point of 1619, is to assert that the US is a racist nation, was from the beginning, and still is today. And fear of being called racist has tied up the entire society, and especially white leaders, including university figures, are terrified of being called racist. And to avoid that, they have capitulated to what the activists want. I thought you would say more about that than you have, but my question is very simple. Why does the claim of racism have this extraordinary power to suppress active discussion of this key issue, whereas it didn't have it at the time of the founding, even though the founders knew perfectly well that race was an issue because of slavery in the South? But nobody was terrified of being called race or racist. Why are they terrified today?
Well, because there was racism almost right away. Once blacks were freed, there was segregation that emerges very quickly in the North, separating the races. And that, of course, became worse as time went on. In the South, there was no racism of that sort because they remained slaves right up through the Civil War. And I think that's what we're talking about, is the segregation. I mean, I was talking last night to my first experience was 1942. I was 8 years old. My father took me from Worcester, Massachusetts, down to Palatka, Florida, to visit his mother, who was living with his sister in Palatka, Florida. And that my aunt there had a black mammy who was a stereotype, a very warm-hearted and wonderful woman. And she took my cousin and me, we were both 8 years old, to a movie. And she started up the stairs to the balcony, and we were ushered into the orchestra, and I threw a tantrum as an 8-year-old kid. I couldn't understand that. Why couldn't she come and sit with us? Because she was taking care of us. And that was my first awareness of segregation. It was a terrible thing. And many people didn't think, including Lincoln, at least at the outset, that the two races could live side by side. And that was the thinking of many people through the 19th century. I don't think many think that now. I think we have to count on, and this is my solution, it's not going to come through it's going to come through intermarriage. And I use the example of the crisis of 100 years ago, which is, in many respects, was very severe, not perhaps as severe as what we're going through now, but really bad, with the anti-immigrant feeling. All of these immigrants from Eastern Europe, the Poles, and then the Italians and the Jews coming in ever increasing numbers. They had about we had the same proportion of foreign-born then as we have now. Maybe 14% of our population was foreign-born. And it was just a crisis that it seemed to many people. John Dos Passos, the great novelist, said, in light of the Sacco Vanzetti trial, which was, as I say, was just like George Floyd, all right then, we are two nations, meaning there's native-born and foreign-born. And he implied that we'll never come together. Well, of course, we did come together. Over the next 50 years, 60 years, there was intermarriage. And the Poles married some Irish, and some Jews married non-Jews. And, Abe's Irish Rose. I mean, that's the secret. And it's going to take time. Intermarriage of blacks and whites is not very high, maybe 7-8%. But Asians and non-Asians are marrying at about a 50% ratio. Jews and non-Jews are marrying at 50%. Intermarriage is the secret. Now, you lose your ethnic consciousness, but it's the melting pot notion. And now people deny that. I mean, Moynihan and Glaser wrote a book, Beyond the Melting Pot, said it didn't melt as much as you think it did, but it still melted, and it's still going on. The intermarriage rate is very high of all these various groups, and that is our hope, that white and black intermarriage will blur the situation. Certainly it's going to happen it's already happening with the Hispanics. So that is our only solution to the problem. I'm not going to solve it by some legislation passed by Congress. It's just, I think that's the hope. And it may take a long time, but I think that's going to be the solution.
Or it may take even less time, since I look a lot like what you just described. I had, let's see, I'm going to count them now. One Jewish great-grandfather, one Irish great-grandfather, one Swedish great-grandfather. Yeah, and all mixed together. And that happened in just 3 generations. So yes, that is the kind of thing, that dissolvent that is at work, and that dissolvent is there because the American environment encourages it and develops it. Now, second question right beside. Yes, go ahead. You don't like technology either, do you, Paul? Right. Okay, we've got that together.
Paul Carice, Arizona State University. A question about patriotism and the academic professions. I'm political science, history. Is there a possibility of university professors and scholars having some awareness in these 2 disciplines, history and political science, of responsibility about patriotism, given that everyone they're educating, not just the teachers who will go on to be teachers in schools, but everybody receiving a university degree will in some degree be a leader in American society. Is there a way to strike a balance between a responsibility for cultivating or perpetuating patriotism about America with the academic criticism and debate and discussion, dissent that is so central to academia?
Well, I don't think at the university level you can tell the students how to be patriotic. I just don't think that would backfire. Whatever teaching should go on in the early schools. I mean, that's the way that generation of 1900, 1920 handled it. That's when you get the Plymouth Rock myth, the Mayflower, those poor pilgrims coming here and so on. And those stories are what, 8-year-olds like to hear, and that's where you breed a certain kind of the myths maybe of American life, where you breed a certain kind. But at the university level, there's nothing you can do of that sort. You just tell the story as honestly as you can. Now, if you're going to just repeat what Hannah Jones says, then of course you're going to get a very different student body. But I think you have to face the fact that that blacks have suffered 400 years, not only 200 years or 180 years of slavery, but then segregation, that it continued right up until the 1960s, and even today to some remnants of it, but nothing like what this generation's parents or grandparents suffered. We have to recognize that, acknowledge it, but somehow offer that America is capable of being better. And I think we're doing that. And these excesses that we get, wokeism and so on, I think need to be resisted, but understood at the same time. Otherwise, you're not going to get convince these young people. All you can do in your classes, it seems to me, is just tell history or politics as honestly and realistically as you can, without trying to force the issue, because it won't work.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'm looking over here because now I'm seeing many hands. But I'm going to disappoint some people. But
okay, you initially called for undergraduates. A long time ago, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, I heard a memorable lecture. I've never forgotten it, by a great American legal historian named William Thomas Hutchinson, who died in the 1970s. I looked it up. And his argument was that the conservatism of the American Revolution in law was, and compared it to the French Revolution, is that they built the American legal system on, first of all, 200 years of colonial experience, and secondly, that English common law could still be cited in American cases. So in that sense, he was arguing for the legal conservatism of the American legal tradition at the time of the Revolution and thereafter. Could you comment? Do you agree with him or not?
No, that's true. There's no doubt that our revolution did not, in large part, did not go the way of the French Revolution, is because the leaders were Brits, were Englishmen. They had a tradition of liberty from the very beginning. I mean, the English themselves, vis-a-vis the Europe, were considered to be radical libertarians. George III said England is all about liberty. He celebrated liberty. And the Americans had that, and they had the common law, and they had a Bill of Rights. I mean, England was itself an extraordinary, exceptional nation, if you will, in the 18th century, regarded by the French as being wild and crazy. How can those Englishmen, commoners go into Hyde Park and mingle with the aristocrats? How could that be? I mean, so England had this reputation already. We, as Burke pointed out, we were the excessive English. We had, we smelt liberty in every tainted breeze. Tyranny, I mean, in every tainted breeze, we were ultra Englishmen. And I think that was important that we were English and had an English tradition to fall back on. And a whole Bill of Rights, all of that was part of being, so Americans conceived of their colonial rebellion as a defense of the English Constitution. At one point, at a final point, they came to realize that, well, we can't talk about English rights. We're breaking away from England, so let's just call them natural rights. But they were English rights, and they show up in our Bill of Rights. So without, that tradition is crucially important and separates our revolution from the French Revolution. They had nothing to fall back on of that sort as we did.
There is a healing and a revitalization that springs from the study of history. And Gordon, we were chatting beforehand very briefly about one of those stories. It's about Washington. Rufus King, during the brief time he was American minister to Great Britain after the Revolution, heard this story, that it was explained to King George III that George Washington had voluntarily surrendered his commission as General-in-Chief to the Continental Congress, the Confederation Congress, which startled the king. "If this be true," said King George III, "then he is the greatest man of the age." I haven't discovered anything in reading anything about George Washington in many years that qualifies that. These are the stories that make us what we are. And Gordon, you have contributed so much to the telling of these stories for all of us. So while we're at the end of our conversation this morning, and I wish we could have taken every question, I would say that the best place to continue exploring American history and the American Revolution is with Gordon Wood himself. So for this afternoon, and before we take off for lunch, I want to say thank you, Gordon Wood, and thank you to everyone. Lunch awaits us, but let us thank Gordon Wood especially.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think they like it.
Yeah.
Well, what a way to begin, and what a blessing to be able to learn from not just one, but two of the greatest American historians of our age. Please join me in thanking Alan Guelzo and Gordon Wood. And I also want to thank Robert Giuffra and the Giuffra family, who are our sponsors and benefactors for this conference. Robert Giuffra is a distinguished graduate of this university and of the Harvard Law School. He went on to clerk at the Supreme Court of the United States and is now the co-chairman of Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most eminent firms in the United States. And although neither Mr. Giuffra nor anyone from his family could be with us today, they wrote us a nice note explaining that they wouldn't be able to join us as much as they wanted to. He wishes all of us the best and told us how proud he is to be able to sponsor this conference and to support the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and the fellows who have come to be with us. So please join me in thanking Mr. Giuffra and his family.